Welcome to the Children in Scotland podcast. In this episode, our Head of Policy Projects and Participation, Amy Woodhouse, is in conversation with Neil Cowan from the Poverty Alliance. They talk about the aims of this year's Challenge Poverty Week, explore the ongoing impact of poverty on children and families across Scotland, and discuss the measures that still need to be taken to ensure an end to child poverty. Hi, my name is Amy Woodhouse and I am the Head of Policy Projects and Participation at Children in Scotland, and I'm joined today by Neil Cowan from the Poverty Alliance. Neil, do you want to just introduce yourself and say a little bit about who the Poverty Alliance are?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Neil Cowan. I'm Policy and Campaigns Manager at the Poverty Alliance. So the Poverty Alliance is Scotland's national anti-poverty network. So we're a network comprised of, I think, around 350 organisations from across Scotland. That ranges from large NGOs to small community-based organisations, trade unions, faith groups, and individuals as well, all of whom are committed to tackling poverty. So that's what we do.
And we're talking today because, well, hopefully when this recording goes out, it'll be Challenge Poverty Week, which the Poverty Alliance coordinates, and that this year it's the 3rd to the 9th of October. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And the main aims of the week are about highlighting the reality of poverty and challenging stereotypes and showcasing solutions to poverty and increasing public support for action to solve poverty. Is there any particular focus this year?
Yes, I think this year Challenge Poverty Week is obviously taking place at a really challenging time for a lot of people. So we all know about the cost of living crisis, and that comes after the impacts of the pandemic as well. So I think the cost of living crisis will kind of necessarily dominate or naturally dominate a lot of the discussions and activities that take place throughout this Challenge Poverty Week.
Yeah, and it's really dire, isn't it? I mean, we're getting new reports almost on a daily basis about how folk are struggling and how families are struggling. I saw One Parent Family Scotland's report today, Living Without a Lifeline, their research, which was showing really high levels of worry about how people are going to make basic costs for food and fuel, and it's likely to get worse over the winter, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's the real overriding sense at the moment. It's people's fear and anxiety about what is to come. So clearly things are tough at the moment with rising energy bills, etc. With inflation, things are incredibly challenging at the moment, and we're hearing some really difficult stories about people's experiences in communities across Scotland, and what they're having to try and do to keep themselves afloat, and how organisations are helping keep them afloat as well. Some really, really challenging stories, but I think there is that real fear and anxiety over what kind of comes next over the coming months, and some of the measures announced by the UK government in terms of the freezing of the price cap, I guess takes maybe the most extreme edge off that anxiety, but the fact is that the winter months will pull a lot more people into poverty and hardship. So I think what Challenge Poverty Week is an opportunity to say that kind of hardship and that poverty is not inevitable. It need not be that way. And actually, there are a whole range of solutions that we can implement, a whole range of actions that governments can take to stem this rising tide of poverty and to make sure that people don't have to experience the kind of hardship that they're fearing.
Yeah, and I know the answer to this question already, but I mean, what do you think of the UK government's response thus far? Have they done enough?
No, absolutely not. I think the response from the UK government has been completely and entirely inadequate. Whether that comes from a sense of not understanding the context in which people are living their lives and the context in which people are having to really struggle to stay afloat, or whether it's through indifference to those circumstances, I wouldn't say, but it's been quite clear that in terms of policy proposals that have been brought forward and implemented by the UK government, they've been fundamentally lacking. So things like the energy price cap freeze that was announced a couple of weeks ago, it's welcome in the sense that it'll, as I say, take some of the roughest edges off what could have been, that additional price cap increase. But we know the energy prices are still astronomically high compared to where they were a while ago. And we know that they're still pushing people into poverty. So no, I think there's a whole range of things the UK government could and should do if they're serious about actually helping people cope with the crisis.
Mm-hmm. And some of the solutions that are getting mooted in various parts, like heat banks, for example, just they're shocking, aren't they, really, in their inadequacy to address the seriousness of it.
Yeah, I think the idea of heat banks or warm banks or whatever they're termed is a really challenging one to kind of grapple with, because on one hand, you can see the instincts of whether it's local authorities or community groups to kind of offer that service, because they see the crisis that's happening in their communities, and they see the fact that people are struggling so much to heat their homes, and so in one sense, things like warm banks are a sort of logical response to it, but we know that they shouldn't be, and we know that even the very notion that warm banks should be established should really shock us all and really should shame policymakers that have allowed that kind of situation to develop. So I think for us, moves to introduce things like warm banks in communities, it's kind of born out of a sense of compassion, because people think, oh, this will protect others in my community, this will protect my neighbours, etc., etc. But the fact that they're required is a real disgrace, and I think the onus is on policymakers at every level to implement policy that means that warm banks just are not a feature in the UK in 2022.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose it's not been that long since we had the programme for government out from the Scottish Government as well, and they announced some measures about what can be done within the devolved powers that they have. Have you got any thoughts on was there much new in there? Was there anything that you took optimism for, or is it a similar story?
I think there were some positive signs. So things like the additional increase to the Scottish Child Payment is really welcome. Mm-hmm. So we and lots of others campaigned really hard last year to get the Scottish Child Payment doubled, and we were successful, which we were pleased about. But we also know that even with the additional £5 on top of that doubling to make it £25, it still is likely not going to be enough to protect a lot of families across Scotland from poverty. So while the increase announced in the programme of government, although it was announced earlier, and while that is welcome, we know that the Scottish Government will have to go further on that. They will have to increase the value of Scottish Child Payment. It would just be absolutely essential to help people cope. Other things like the rent freeze, it's welcome. It's obviously received a lot of attention, I think. It received a lot of attention when it was announced, and it's certainly welcome. But I think the one thing to say about that is that it's not going to make anything actually better. It'll stop things getting worse. But it's not going to actually put additional cash into people's pockets. So it's not necessarily going to lift people out of poverty. It will just protect them from deeper poverty, which is obviously a good thing. But I suppose that's the kind of the key caveat there. So I think generally in terms of programme of government, definitely some good steps, things that we would welcome. But in terms of the kind of more transformative change that we would want to see, that wasn't there.
Poverty Alliance and Children in Scotland and a number of other children's organisations, or we work together, don't we, on the End Child Poverty Coalition. And I know that through that, one of the things that we call for is a cash first approach, we often call it. And the Scottish Child Payment would be a good example of that, wouldn't it, in terms of actually it's about putting money into people's pockets and hands so that they can make the choices themselves about what they need to spend it on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I think we all know that poverty is just fundamentally a bit of lack of income, and the way that you solve poverty is to get more cash into people's pockets. I think it's kind of as simple as that. And I think now, the Scottish Government does have a whole range of social security powers, and it is utilising those powers in ways such as the Scottish Child Payment, which, it does offer a direct route into the pockets of low-income families. And as you say, it provides, that kind of cash first approach does provide people with the choice and the freedom to spend their money how they best see fit, because they're the experts on their own lives and on their own families, and they know what their needs are. And so while, not to kind of negate the importance of things like, childcare and transport and all of these things that we have to make much more affordable, a cash first approach, getting cash into people's pockets, is the absolute central thing we have to do to end poverty and end child poverty in Scotland. And so that's why things like the Scottish Child Payment, I think in the next couple of years, we'll have to do a lot of the heavy lifting on the way to meeting the child poverty target. So we need to really invest more in that and in other benefits for low-income families and supports for low-income families, if we're to have a chance in meeting those targets.
Yeah, and so we should probably talk a little bit about those targets. So they were outlined in the Child Poverty Act a few years ago, and there are a set of targets to reduce child poverty, and we've got a deadline of 2030 for the final targets, but some interim targets that are due to be met next year. And all projections that I've seen anyway, I don't know if you've seen any different, would suggest that it's going to be a real challenge to actually meet those interim targets by the dates that they've been set.
Yes, I mean, I think it's, there's a range of different projections. So some projections that have been published suggest that, we're not on track. The Scottish Government earlier this year published projections that showed that with the additional actions in the new Child Poverty Delivery Plan, they believe that the targets will be met or should be met, provided what they expect to happen actually happens. I think irrespective, it is going to be a challenge, but I think the important thing to bear in mind with the child poverty targets, and with whether it's the interim targets in 2024 or the final ones in 2030, is that they were set and supported by every single MSP from every single political party in Scotland. So the Child Poverty Act was unanimously supported in Holyrood, and I think that was a really important symbol and statement of public and political will to end child poverty. And so meeting the targets it's not a kind of party political thing. It should be a genuine national mission in the way the Scottish Government talks about it. But the only thing that will get us towards those targets is policy and is genuine investment in prioritisation of actions that will end child poverty and that will reduce child poverty. So I guess, long story short, the targets will be really challenging. But they can be met, and I think more importantly, they have to be met for a whole variety of reasons. Most importantly, the fact that it's just a moral good that we do this.
Yeah, and that's really important to remember. This is that they are not just figures and percentages, are they? They're people's lives, and I think that's a really good point to remember about the cross-party commitment for it, and that it's something really fundamental, isn't it? That we all should be agreeing to make progress towards. And I suppose the challenges is about the hard decisions that are necessary and to actually achieve those targets, and it was a different world as well, wasn't it? Of course, when the Act was passed, and we wouldn't have predicted pandemics and also the developments that we've seen over the last couple of years.
Yeah, in the last couple of years of there's absolutely no doubt that the last couple of years, in terms of the impact of the pandemic and the kind of ongoing impact of the cost of living crisis, there's no denying that will, and already has, made things more difficult in terms of meeting the targets. But the simple fact remains that there is that cross-party will, and there is just that overriding moral imperative that the actions that are required are prioritised. And in terms of kind of prioritisation within the Scottish Government, the Scottish Government have said that it is their national mission to end child poverty. So that was the words of Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, after the last election. So that's really welcome. But it's really it's absolutely essential that there's kind of meat put on those bones, so to speak, and that kind of really, really welcome, ambitious rhetoric is matched by the reality, and that means increased financial investment over and above what's already been made. To try and loosen the grip of poverty on people's lives.
And so you talked about the Scottish Child Payment as doing the heavy lifting for a lot of that. So that obviously means an increase to that, and rolling out for older children and their families sooner. And but is there anything else that you would see as being really important?
Well, I think there's a whole range of things, so I won't this be like a 3-hour podcast if I everything. But I think the Scottish Child Payment is absolutely essential. I think there's no route to meeting the child poverty targets that doesn't involve the Scottish Child Payment taking on a lot of the strain and taking on in a lot of the investment. I think on things like childcare, we could definitely go much further. So it's good that there is a reasonable childcare entitlement in Scotland, but that could go further. So if we expanded that free childcare entitlement, that could, for example, support much more women back into work after having children. At the moment, it's not quite as flexible as it could be. So in terms of reducing labour market inequalities, which is obviously intricately linked with child poverty, that would be a big one. There's also things we could do around transport. So there's been some positive steps in the past couple of years around the expansion of free bus travel for younger people. We have been calling for a number of years now for an expansion of free bus travel to people on low income benefits, because we know that transport is absolutely critical in terms of opening up employment opportunities, opening up access to services that people rely upon. But we also know that it's far too often just entirely unaffordable for a lot of folk in a lot of communities. So I think on things like transport, we could go much further. That's not to mention things like housing, for example, where there's huge opportunities to reduce costs for people by investing significantly more sums in the building of social housing, for example. So I could go on for a long time about the things that we could do, but I think the important thing to say is that there are an enormous amount of powers the Scottish Government has to do something about child poverty and poverty in general that don't depend upon the UK government. This is without even touching upon the Scottish Government's taxation powers. They would allow it to boost the investment it can make. So I think across a whole range of areas, there's a whole range of options open to the Scottish Government that they can take.
That's really important. There are things that can be done, because sometimes it can feel a little hopeless, can't it? But actually, we do have power to do a lot. And thank you for bringing in the point about gender and how there is a gendered component to poverty as well, of course, and that women with children are more likely to be living in poverty, and the importance of childcare. And I should point out that by the time this podcast goes out, our report on the Access to Childcare Fund will be published, fingers crossed, which was a Scottish Government fund to increase access to school-aged childcare for families at risk of poverty and on low incomes. And having done the report, one of the couple of things that really struck me was not just about the practical value of things like childcare in terms of helping people to get into employment or study, but actually also the support that provides for those families as well, for their mental health and their well-being, and for the children too, in terms of just having places to play and be with other children. And certainly where families were offered family support through the childcare, how that helped in many different ways. So it's really powerful in terms of the mental health dimension to living with poverty, and how we can't forget that. We can't forget the whole person that goes with it. It's not just again about income, is it?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think the links between poverty and poorer mental health outcomes are just they're clear and undeniable and well evidenced. And I think that's something that we have really seen. The links have really kind of, I guess, solidified, or the impacts have kind of got worse over the past couple of months. So one of the things that we've been doing over the past few months is holding regular Poverty Alliance members meetings, where we bring together community-based organisations, so grassroots organisations who are working really on the front line with people, to kind of report back to us on what they're seeing in communities as the cost of living crisis continues to bite. And one of the absolute standout things that people have spoken to us about has been the mental health and well-being impact on people over the last few months, just that kind of fear and that anxiety that I spoke about previously. And that adds to the existing mental health burden or stress that exists because of living in poverty, even irrespective of the current situation. I think keeping those issues in mind alongside the imperative of getting cash into people's pockets is really important. And that, as you say, things like family support is a really kind of essential part of that as well.
Yeah. And so another Children in Scotland forum that we run is the Children's Sector Strategic Forum, and one of our priority areas through that is child poverty as well. And we had a conversation about it a couple of weeks ago, and about the importance of policy cohesion across Scottish Government, which isn't perhaps the most dynamic of campaign arguments, however, is really essential if we're going to address this, because it does need a joined up approach, doesn't it, in terms of all parts of government playing their role and recognising their role, and not undermining each other with some of their decisions. We were talking about areas where there was potentially movements of budgets to address the cost of living crisis, and how careful we had to be that some of those decisions weren't undermining the very families that we were hoping to support with moving into emergency funding solutions.
Yeah, I think that's an enormous point, and I think as you say, it's maybe not the kind of snazziest or most glamorous campaign point, but it's vitally important. I mean, only a couple of weeks ago, it was announced as part of the emergency budget review, or it was proposed by the Scottish Government that there be cuts to their employability spend and also concessionary travel spend. On the travel thing, we were assured that it wouldn't actually have any impact on eligibility, but nonetheless, it's still a significant cut. So that's two really key areas in terms of tackling poverty and tackling child poverty, employability and transport. And if, we're seeing those budgets cut, then that's obviously a deep concern. It doesn't really tally with the notion that tackling child poverty is a national mission. So it should be the responsibility of every CAPSEC, of every minister, of every official in the Scottish Government to be thinking about how they tackle child poverty. So even thinking about we're planning for Challenge Poverty Week, we're thinking about, which ministers or which CAPSECs will we engage with. And actually it's all of them, because poverty cuts across every portfolio. So I think it's really important to keep banging that drum to the Scottish Government and to UK Government, but for us, particularly Scottish Government, about the need to have that kind of cohesion within government.
And another thing that we've been focusing on as well is, I suppose, reflecting on the pandemic experience, how appreciative the third sector was about the flexibility that was given from funders, including the Scottish Government and other funders as well, to pivot, hate that word, but can't think of another one, and change their commitments to address the needs of the families that those organisations were supporting, and how welcome it would be if that flexibility could be maintained. There's a concern that some of it has already gone, but actually the third sector organisations are often the best placed to support families in urgent need of help and need a bit of flexibility in how they do that.
Yeah, definitely. And that's been one of the really clear messages from community organisations that are part of the Poverty Alliance Network over the last couple of months, and probably even before that as well. The fact that in the response to the pandemic, so much flexibility was shown, and also so much additional investment was kind of necessarily made as well. But so much flexibility was shown with that investment. And as you say, organisations could and did, adapt how they operated, adapt their services really, really flexibly, and really kind of at speed as well, like within days or weeks, had transformed the way they operated in order to meet their community's needs. And that was pretty, I think that was pretty incredible, actually. But I think, certainly what we're hearing from a lot of our community-based organisation members is that flexibility has all but disappeared. But we're also hearing, particularly over the last couple of months with the cost of living crisis biting even more, is just about the gap, which is probably already growing, but it's growing even more now, between the capacity of organisations to respond with the kind of demand that they're seeing. So a lot of organisations that we've spoken to, community-based grassroots organisations, are talking about the sort of scale of demand and need being far in excess of what they saw during the pandemic. And that they're even more anxious now than they were during the pandemic about how their organisation itself can cope. So, a lot of organisations talking to us about the impact on staff and volunteer well-being of just being faced with this kind of enormous rising tide of poverty they're having to respond to, but just not feeling like they have the capacity or the ability to respond to it, because they're not necessarily maybe being supported in the way that they need to be, or don't necessarily have the flexibility to respond in the way that they should, or the way they feel they can. So I think that's something that we need to keep really banging the drum for with Scottish Government, but other funders as well. Just that, the scale of this, of the kind of the hardship we're seeing at the moment is enormous. And if community organisations and other third sector organisations are to respond the way they want to, then it's flexibility, but it's also ultimately probably additional investment that's required as well.
And protecting staff as well, and thinking about their well-being through all of this too, so and volunteers, that's really important too. So if people want to find out what's going on in Challenge Poverty Week, how do they find out more? get involved?
So they can obviously go on our social media channels, so the Poverty Alliance Twitter, but also the Challenge Poverty Week Twitter, which is getting updated a lot at the moment. It's also a Challenge Poverty Week website, challengepoverty.net, and that has on it an event calendar, and that should have a sort of thorough list of all the events and activities that are taking place across Scotland throughout the week that people can hopefully get involved in or be aware of. So yeah, there's lots happening really across Scotland, both in person and online. So huge number of opportunities for folk to get involved. So yeah, we'd really encourage anyone that wants to do just that.
Great, thank you. And out with Challenge Poverty Week, are there ways that people can get involved with the Poverty Alliance or other campaigns or activities that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, absolutely. So, people can join the Poverty Alliance, whether individuals or community organisations or charities. We have a really strong and growing network of people across Scotland that believe in need to end poverty. So, we'd always encourage people to join the Poverty Alliance. We also have a number of ongoing campaigns that people can do loads to support. So, for example, we have a campaign called Everyone Aboard, which is calling for an expansion of free bus travel to more younger people and also to people on low income benefits. So the how to get involved in that can be found on our website, as well as lots of other ways that folk can get involved in our work.
Thanks for your time today. It's been really interesting to hear your perspective on it, and hopefully together we can push for a bit of progress and remain hopeful that change can happen.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much. Cheers.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to the Children in Scotland podcast. To find out more about all of our work, including the work of our policy projects and participation team, head to our website at childreninscotland.org.uk.